press record and we'll be ready to go. So, David, I think we're ready to grapple with the question of forgetting in light of the totality of Christian history. Forgetting and the place of forgetting.
Yes, the critical thing, it seems to me, in Christian remembering as regards things that one would want to forget is probably forgiving. It is about forgiveness. And that's more about the transformation of memory rather than the forgetting of. There's not a lot of discourse about forgetting, actually. Forgetting is, on the whole, quite a negative concept. But it is certainly utterly crucial that one remembers things that are bad, the really painful, awful memories, that they can be transformed somehow. And so could you just say a little bit more, Alon, about what you think of as the possible significance of forgetting in Christianity? I mean, there's a debate among theologians about it, about whether certain things are simply, have to be forgotten, or whether they are transformed only.
I think the difficulty comes in. The question comes in the context of difficult memories, especially in intergroup relations, and how to heal those and how to deal with those. I think that's where the question of forgetting is contextualized. Am I right, Peter?
There's that, and there's also the question of whether we construct a narrative by consciously or unconsciously forgetting some of the story and selecting the memories that are going to...
Oh, yes. Oh, well. Oh, no, I absolutely see that. And, it is the complex question of historical truth, isn't it? Let me give an example, that I am, at present involved in writing a commentary on the Gospel of John. And there are elements in the Gospel of John that have been extraordinarily painful in Christian-Jewish encounters. That the reception of John has been, frankly, appalling often in Christianity. And what do we do with that terrible tradition, as Christians? Now, my way of approaching that is that, we have to, first of all, be reminded of it. And of course, that has been a very good thing, it seems to me, in recent decades, for Christians to be reminded of that. But the healing of it, it seems to me, well, I just remember sitting down with my dear friend Peter Oakes, as a Christian and a Jew, reading chapter 8 of John's Gospel together and trying to see how on earth can we heal this tradition by a new form of reception and a new form of relationship. And I'm not sure forgetting it, as you've described it, forgetting is quite a negative thing. You forget it in order to remember certain things, and you probably should be reminded of the things you're forgetting. That's fine. I think that's a good way of looking at it. But I think that the healing of the terrible things that have happened between traditions, and obviously that there is a particularly terrible history between Christians and Jews, not least in relation to how John's Gospel has been used alongside other scriptures, in order to demonize Jews, persecute Jews, kill Jews. That needs a deep healing, and I don't think Christians can do it without the help of Jews, without reading together with Jews and trying to find a better way forward. So the memories of Jews and the memories of Christians. In other words, I think those bad events, we need both memories from both sides, and we need the deepest resources of both traditions, it seems to me too, in order to heal things like that.
How does the healing come about?
Well, I think it fundamentally comes about by, some sense that one has faced the truth, that within the mercy of God, it is possible to go on living together, and that there will be a better future in God's providence. That a merciful God will not just leave you with an absolutely terrible situation that you cannot live beyond, that the only answer is suicide or saying, I abandon my tradition. I do think, as a Christian, for all the pathologies of my own tradition, I do think we have the resources in our tradition for having a better future, for taking part in a better future in relation to these things, and that in God's grace, that is possible. And what I hope is that there will be Jews and also Muslims and also all sorts of other people who will be open to helping that future to happen in good ways, in better ways than the past. But I think the beginning of it is certainly just recognizing the awful truth often of these things. That what we are about is creating a community of those who try to face those terrible things in the past, who try to remember, but remember together and in ways that say the darkness is not the last word, that God's light is ultimate.
What you've said is just now so profound. I almost want to leave it at the end of the interview, but maybe we can just go back to something you talked about earlier, and that was you used the term identity frequently in your opening remarks regarding memory. And I wondered whether you would just flesh out a little further the relationship as you see it between memory and identity.
Well, this goes for me personally in my theological formation back to the great Hans Frei, F-R-E-I, one of my teachers, whose core book is The Identity of Jesus Christ. And what he does in that book, it seems to me, is something that is really profound in exploring how the identity of Jesus Christ is expressed in the Gospels through his life, death, and resurrection, through the interaction of characters and events over time, and in who he is as rendered through those stories. And of course, that enters into, as I've said already, the DNA, the Christian DNA of baptism and Eucharist. And so what I mean primarily by identity, if you put it in a wider theological context, as a Christian, I believe that God is free to express who God is in historical personal terms, and has done that. And that in Jesus, that one has the Word made flesh, that who God is, God's self-giving, God's self-expression in history. And that therefore the identity of God, as expressed in the I ams of Jesus, is intrinsically linked to the identity of who Jesus is, and that is Christian revelation of who God is. Therefore, that identity for me is linked to those utterly core events and to that central reality of who Jesus is, who God is, and therefore who I am.
Well, that use of I and the individual leads me to ask about personal identity and personal memory, as opposed to perhaps collective memory and collective identity. I wondered whether you'd reflect on that, particularly from your Christian perspective.
Well, clearly everyone has their own distinctive personal memory. And I think part of Christian formation is working through just what it means to have your personal identity, whatever it is. I'm an Irish Anglican who's all sorts of other things as well, male, white, etc. How that identity is to be baptized, if you like, is to be transformed, taken up and transformed in relationship to one's membership of the Christian community and its relationship to every other community, to the whole, contemporary world and to history and so forth. And that's an ongoing thing, of course, that one never comes to the end of. So one's personal identity is constantly and radically relational. I suppose the most basic form for me personally is trying to come to terms with the astonishing truth that I am loved by God like this. That to think that one is actually loved radically, and therefore that all of the rest of one's life can be an overflow of that identity, that one can utterly trust that one is loved, forgiven by God, one is sent by God, one is told that one's most basic command is to love one another as I have loved you, which is what Jesus said. That working out that as is the biggest thing, it seems to me, in identity. How is it that one can stay true to a vocation like that in history? But of course, intrinsic to it is being part of a community, but also increasingly for me, that community is only fulfilled by having right relations to other communities, both religious and non-religious. And so, my vision for the world in terms of my little personal identity is to be part of a world where there is a healthy pluralism of multiple depths, where my trying to sound the depths of my own Christian experience and identity, it resonates with others, and it joins in conversation and collaboration with others who go into their depths. And I think, that's why scriptural reasoning has been so important for me, because what I have found in scriptural reasoning is one among many practices, but this is the one I have found, where as I go deeper into the scriptures and identities of others, I go deeper into my own, and we also together go deeper into our shared world.
Alon, was there anything else you'd like to ask David at this point?
If you could recommend for us a couple of texts that you think we would want to look at together as we dig deeper into your words. What could you suggest 2 or 3 texts that you think students should be looking at?
Well, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John seem to me just utterly crucial, to what I've been saying. In other words, take a synoptic gospel and take John's Gospel.
Are you talking about the entire Gospel or a specific chapter? If you look at the opening of Luke, he's particularly concerned about remembering, that's what he sets out to do, to remember in a particular way. And I think there is they're not long texts, they're both relatively short texts, and they are really the core text. Also, I think one should do a letter of Paul. And in that, I think, the one that has been most deeply influential on me, I spent 5 years writing a book on it with Frances Young. She and I, just spent years writing on this little letter, is the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, which I think it distills very, often Romans is used, and that's a wonderful one to look at too, but a much more manageable one is 2 Corinthians. And you get a sense of who Paul is in that, but also of his attempt to articulate absolutely his core identity as a Christian, as an apostle, and what that meant to the church.
So I mean, within the New Testament, I'd go those. I think also Christian identity can't be understood apart from, Torah and the writings, the Psalms especially. I mean, the Psalms have just been so fundamental to Christian identity that to choose a few key Psalms, would be a very fruitful way as well. And I always think of Christian, in terms of scripture, Christian identity is best understood in this dynamic intertextuality between New Testament and Old Testament.
So the specific New Testament texts are Luke 1.
Well, not. I do Luke 1. I'd do the probably Luke 4. It would be where the baptism is, and do the Luke's account of the Last Supper, and then do Luke 24, his account of the resurrection, because that's when Jesus in Luke's gospel, in the resurrection account, opens the scriptures to his disciples. In other words, he says, look, these scriptures are where you see the deepest clues to who I am, and of course they are the Hebrew scriptures. They're Israel's scriptures. They're what Christians came to call the Old Testament.
That's Luke. The text in John you would recommend?
And then within John, there's an interesting one. I think it has to be the first chapter of John. It also the best one is to do again the John 13 to 17, especially that extraordinary prayer in chapter 17, which is like a midrash on the Lord's Prayer, actually, and then the final two chapters, 20 and 21.
With all this discussion, I've remembered something that I think I should have asked you earlier. You see, it's memory. I needed a jog. And that is, I wondered if you'd comment on when we were talking about shared Christian memory. Obviously, within different branches of Christianity, there might be some different memories of Christian history, post-biblical Christian history. Utterly, and I wonder whether you comment just for a moment on the different ways that Christians today might look back on their history, differences.
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, my brother is a historian of Irish Christianity, and one of his main preoccupations has been the different ways in which Protestants and Catholics have told Irish Christian history, which is radically different. And he is at the forefront of the attempt to try to look at that again and to try to understand just, how those histories and identities have been formed through the telling of their history. So that's just in my own little corner of the world in Ireland, that's been so important and is continuing to be important. And I think that the real thing is that, when one is continually trying to seek wisdom on these things, and the wisdom has to be funded by decent history, by really open-eyed history as far as one can. But of course, that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do when there are really conflictual identities because of the ways those histories have been told and are embedded and so forth. And again, I come back to my own way, is that memory and hope are deeply related, that one should that if one is going back into the history just in order to have a clinical account of what actually happened or something, that's not going to be enough in relation to it. I think one needs to go back into a history with an understanding of the full dynamics of what has gone wrong in a history and trying to face that, and then try to bring that up into a present and an orientation to the future that is dedicated to reconciliation, to a peaceful future, to a future that heals those things. That's a massive task, but I'm very suspicious of the sort of histories that simply are trying to apportion blame, for example, without any horizon of a better future.
I should also ask you, as a woman, about the perhaps the forgetting of women's history in Christianity and the failure to include the female narrative throughout. Do you sense that is something that's significant?
Oh my goodness, yes. No, I think my wife is an Anglican priest and a psychotherapist, and on both fronts, that is deeply relevant. And it seems to me that, St. Paul talked about Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, about them being reconciled somehow in Christ, and really Christianity, attempted but often failed, to reconcile Jew and Gentile. There's a terrible history there, but I hope a history that's getting better. The slave and free wasn't really faced at the national level, by Christian countries until the 18th century, really, and still is a huge issue. Slavery is, and the male and free was only really faced, I think, fully by churches in the 20th century. And the reason my wife is a priest is that there was a long struggle in order to try to heal that particular dimension of Christian history, which often led to the oppression of women and the exclusion of women and so forth, and that hopefully that is getting better. But my closest colleague in Cambridge University for 24 years when I was there was Janet Soskis, who is a wise Christian feminist, who has some wonderful writings on this. And I learned a great deal from her, being my close colleague, over those, about what sort of wisdom we need in order both to face that past and to shape a better future.
Well, thank you so much. I think that we're going to wrap up. We've got a lot of editing out of all those silly interruptions that we had earlier.
Yes.
But we have some absolute treasure of material. And even if you felt you weren't prepared, I think you've offered us some remarkable insights that are going to be very, very useful. So I want to thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much. The family here has been pleading with